Welcome to Framework, the podcast that makes the NIST cybersecurity framework practical, engaging, and accessible. Whether you're a cybersecurity professional, business leader, or simply curious about how organizations defend against cyber threats, this series is for you. This podcast is inspired by a comprehensive guide to the NIST Cybersecurity Framework 2.0, a best-selling resource written by cybersecurity expert Dr. Jason Edwards and trusted by professionals worldwide. In each episode, we'll leverage a few insights from Jason's extensive book to dive deep into CSF 2.0, unpacking every function, category, and subcategory with real-world applications you can immediately use. If you're enjoying this episode and want to learn more, head over to cyberauthor.me to grab your copy of the book and access additional resources to enhance your cybersecurity journey. You can also visit baremetalcyber.com, where over 2 million people last year explored expert insights, articles, and practical tools across a wide range of cybersecurity topics. ID.RA-01, identifying and recording asset vulnerabilities. ID.RA-01 ensures that organizations identify, document, and assess vulnerabilities across all assets, including hardware, software, and network infrastructure, to proactively mitigate cybersecurity risks. This subcategory belongs to the Identify function within the National Institute of Standards and Technology Cybersecurity Framework, version 2.0, emphasizing that maintaining visibility into asset vulnerabilities is critical to preventing security breaches, strengthening risk management, and aligning cybersecurity protections with evolving threats. Without structured vulnerability identification and recording, organizations risk overlooking critical security flaws, failing to remediate high-risk weaknesses, and exposing enterprise systems to cyber attacks that exploit known vulnerability. By implementing structured vulnerability identification and documentation processes, organizations ensure that security teams have an accurate understanding of the weaknesses present in their infrastructure and can take proactive steps to remediate risks before they are exploited. A structured approach to vulnerability management enables organizations to track security weaknesses over time, ensure timely remediation, and align risk mitigation strategies with business priorities. Organizations that develop continuous vulnerability scanning programs, enforce structured vulnerability documentation policies, and integrate vulnerability management with cybersecurity governance improve their ability to prevent data breaches, reduce operational disruptions, and maintain compliance with industry cybersecurity regulations. Multiple stakeholders play a role in identifying and recording asset vulnerabilities. Cybersecurity and IT security teams are responsible for conducting vulnerability assessments, documenting security weaknesses, and implementing remediation measures to reduce exposure to cyber threats. Risk management and compliance officers ensure that vulnerability tracking aligns with regulatory cybersecurity frameworks and risk reporting requirements, preventing legal and financial consequences due to unaddressed vulnerabilities. Business leadership and operational teams ensure that identified vulnerabilities are prioritized based on business impact, ensuring that security resources are allocated effectively to protect mission-critical systems. Vulnerability identification and recording are implemented through structured vulnerability assessment frameworks, automated scanning tools, and continuous risk evaluation models. This includes deploying vulnerability management platforms, enforcing structured security patching policies, and ensuring that vulnerability findings are integrated into enterprise risk management and incident response strategies. Organizations that fail to identify and record asset vulnerabilities effectively risk running outdated or misconfigured systems, leaving known weaknesses unpatched, and struggling to respond to cyber incidents due to a lack of visibility into security gaps. Several key terms define vulnerability identification and recording and its role in cybersecurity governance. Vulnerability scanning and assessment ensures that organizations regularly test and evaluate their infrastructure for security weaknesses. Threat intelligence and risk prioritization ensures that organizations assess vulnerabilities based on real-world threat intelligence, prioritizing remediation efforts based on risk severity. Security patch management and remediation ensures that organizations apply necessary security updates to mitigate known vulnerabilities. Regulatory compliance for vulnerability management mandates that organizations align vulnerability tracking and risk reporting with legal cybersecurity requirements. Penetration testing and exploit detection ensures that organizations validate vulnerability assessments by simulating real-world cyber attacks to test security defenses. Challenges in identifying and recording asset vulnerabilities often lead to delayed remediation, inconsistent vulnerability tracking, and failure to integrate vulnerability assessments with broader cybersecurity risk management strategies. One common issue is failure to maintain continuous vulnerability assessments, where organizations conduct security scans infrequently, leaving unpatched vulnerabilities undetected for extended periods. Another issue is lack of structured vulnerability documentation, where organizations identify security weaknesses but fail to record them systematically, leading to poor visibility into unresolved risks. Some organizations mistakenly believe that vulnerability scanning alone is sufficient for security, without recognizing that identified vulnerabilities must be prioritized, tracked, and remediated as part of a continuous cybersecurity risk management program. When organizations implement structured vulnerability identification and recording, they enhance cybersecurity resilience, improve risk-based security enforcement, and ensure that security weaknesses are proactively managed and mitigated. A structured vulnerability management framework ensures that security teams maintain continuous visibility into enterprise weaknesses, remediation efforts remain prioritized based on risk impact, and cybersecurity defenses evolve in alignment with emerging threats. Organizations that implement structured vulnerability scanning processes, enforce automated risk prioritization models, and integrate vulnerability findings into cybersecurity governance, develop a comprehensive risk management strategy that strengthens security posture and reduces exposure to cyber threats proactively. Organizations that fail to identify and record asset vulnerabilities effectively face significant cybersecurity, operational, and compliance risks. Without structured vulnerability identification and tracking, businesses risk leaving critical systems exposed to cyber threats, delaying remediation of known weaknesses, and failing to meet regulatory security requirements. A common issue is failure to prioritize vulnerabilities based on risk severity, where organizations identify weaknesses but do not assess their potential impact, leading to critical security flaws remaining unpatched while lower-risk issues receive attention. Another major challenge is lack of integration between vulnerability assessments and remediation efforts, where organizations conduct security scans but fail to implement structured processes for applying patches and mitigating risks efficiently. By implementing structured vulnerability identification and recording processes, organizations ensure that all security weaknesses are documented, assessed for risk impact, and prioritized for remediation based on real-world threat intelligence. A well-defined vulnerability management framework improves visibility into security gaps, ensures that high-risk vulnerabilities are addressed promptly, and enhances an organization's ability to prevent cyber attacks. Organizations that deploy automated vulnerability scanning tools, enforce structured risk prioritization policies, and integrate vulnerability tracking with cybersecurity incident response strategies improve their ability to detect, prevent, and mitigate cyber threats efficiently. At the partial tier, organizations lack structured vulnerability identification and tracking processes, leading to unorganized security assessments, inconsistent vulnerability remediation, and weak enforcement of risk mitigation measures. Vulnerability management is handled reactively, with organizations only addressing security weaknesses after a cyber attack or security incident reveals a flaw. A small business at this level may lack automated vulnerability scanning tools and rely on ad hoc security checks, leaving critical systems unmonitored for emerging threats. At the risk-informed tier, organizations begin to develop structured vulnerability scanning and risk assessment processes, ensuring that critical systems are periodically evaluated for security weaknesses. However, vulnerability management efforts may still be limited, with inconsistent application of patch management and remediation efforts across different asset categories. A mid-size retail organization at this level may conduct vulnerability scans on customer-facing web applications but fail to apply the same level of security assessments to internal databases and employee workstations, leaving internal assets vulnerable to attacks. At the repeatable tier, organizations implement a fully structured vulnerability management framework, ensuring that all security weaknesses are continuously identified, documented, and prioritized based on potential business impact. Vulnerability management governance is formalized, with leadership actively involved in reviewing security findings and ensuring that remediation efforts align with risk management strategies. A financial institution at this stage may require all banking applications, third-party integrations, and cloud-based infrastructure to undergo continuous vulnerability assessments, ensuring that security weaknesses are identified and remediated before they can be exploited. At the adaptive tier, organizations employ AI-driven vulnerability detection tools, predictive cybersecurity risk analytics, and automated patching solutions to dynamically assess security weaknesses, detect anomalies in real time, and enforce vulnerability remediation measures based on evolving cyber threats. Vulnerability management is fully integrated into enterprise cybersecurity governance, ensuring that security scans, risk assessments, and remediation efforts remain continuously optimized. A global technology company at this level may use AI-powered risk modeling to predict future vulnerabilities based on emerging cyber threat intelligence, dynamically adjust security configurations, and automate risk mitigation workflows based on asset criticality. Identifying and recording asset vulnerabilities aligns with multiple controls in the National Institute of Standards and Technology's Special Publication 800-53, ensuring that organizations implement structured vulnerability assessment frameworks and dynamic cybersecurity risk prioritization models. One key control is RA-5, Vulnerability Monitoring and Scanning, which requires organizations to conduct continuous security assessments to detect, document, and prioritize vulnerabilities based on risk severity. A global healthcare provider implementing this control may deploy enterprise-wide vulnerability scanning solutions that continuously monitor electronic health record systems, ensuring that patient data remains protected against cyber threats. Another key control is SI-2 flaw remediation, which mandates that organizations implement structured processes for applying security patches, mitigating vulnerabilities, and ensuring that risk-based remediation measures are enforced effectively. A manufacturing company implementing this control may use automated patch management tools to distribute security updates across industrial control systems, ensuring that critical operational technology remains protected from cyber exploits. Identifying and recording asset vulnerabilities also aligns with CA-7, continuous monitoring, which requires organizations to actively monitor vulnerabilities in their infrastructure, ensuring that emerging security weaknesses are detected, assessed, and remediated in real time. This control ensures that organizations maintain persistent visibility into cybersecurity risks, leveraging automated threat intelligence feeds and real-time security analytics to track vulnerabilities dynamically. A multinational cloud service provider implementing this control may use continuous security monitoring tools to detect configuration weaknesses in virtualized environments, automatically triggering remediation workflows to mitigate risks before exploitation occurs. These controls can be adapted based on organizational size, industry, and cybersecurity maturity. A small business may implement basic vulnerability scanning measures, ensuring that all company-owned workstations, network devices, and software applications undergo periodic security assessments and manual patching. A large enterprise may deploy AI-driven vulnerability risk assessment platforms, automated threat correlation tools, and predictive security analytics to ensure that security weaknesses are continuously detected, classified, and mitigated in real time. Organizations in highly regulated industries such as financial services, healthcare, and energy may require legally mandated security vulnerability assessments, continuous compliance audits, and structured remediation workflows to ensure that risk management aligns with regulatory cybersecurity requirements. Auditors assess vulnerability identification and recording by reviewing whether organizations have structured, documented, and continuously enforced security risk assessment frameworks. They evaluate whether organizations implement structured vulnerability scanning models, enforce risk-based remediation policies, and integrate security risk classification methodologies into enterprise-wide cybersecurity governance strategies. If an organization fails to maintain structured vulnerability identification and tracking, auditors may issue findings highlighting gaps in security visibility, weak enforcement of vulnerability remediation policies, and failure to align security risk assessments with enterprise cybersecurity risk mitigation strategies. To verify compliance, auditors seek specific types of evidence. Vulnerability scanning reports and structured risk assessment documentation demonstrate that organizations formally define and enforce structured security risk identification governance models. Security patch management records and vulnerability remediation audit logs provide insights into whether organizations proactively address security weaknesses and refine vulnerability mitigation policies based on real-time cybersecurity threat intelligence. Incident response evaluations related to unmitigated vulnerabilities and third-party security risk assessments show whether organizations effectively track, prioritize, and secure enterprise infrastructure against cyber threats, ensuring that vulnerability management remains continuously enforced. A compliance success scenario could involve a global financial institution that undergoes an audit and provides evidence that vulnerability identification and recording processes are fully integrated into enterprise cybersecurity governance, ensuring that security weaknesses are continuously tracked, prioritized based on real-world risk intelligence, and mitigated before they can be exploited by cyber threats. Auditors confirm that security risk assessments are systematically enforced, cybersecurity protections are dynamically adjusted based on vulnerability classifications, and enterprise-wide security policies align with security risk governance requirements. In contrast, an organization that fails to implement structured vulnerability tracking frameworks, neglects risk-based security remediation, or lacks formalized vulnerability classification enforcement models may receive audit findings for poor security risk management, weak cybersecurity risk mitigation, and failure to align vulnerability protection strategies with regulatory compliance mandates. Organizations face multiple barriers in ensuring that vulnerability identification and recording remains continuous and effective. One major challenge is lack of automation in vulnerability scanning, where organizations fail to implement real-time security assessment tools, leading to outdated or incomplete vulnerability tracking. Another challenge is failure to align vulnerability classification policies with evolving cybersecurity threats, where organizations do not update security risk models based on new threat intelligence, increasing exposure to unpatched or newly discovered security weaknesses. A final challenge is over-reliance on manual vulnerability assessment processes, where organizations apply static risk classification methodologies instead of dynamically adjusting security protections based on real-time vulnerability risk analysis and security intelligence updates. Organizations can overcome these barriers by developing structured vulnerability management frameworks, ensuring that cybersecurity protections remain continuously optimized, and integrating real-time vulnerability risk assessments into enterprise-wide cybersecurity governance strategies. Investing in automated vulnerability scanning platforms, predictive security risk modeling tools, and AI-driven vulnerability classification solutions ensures that organizations dynamically assess, monitor, and refine vulnerability tracking strategies in real time. Standardizing vulnerability identification governance methodologies across departments, subsidiaries, and external business partners ensures that vulnerability risk classification policies are consistently applied, reducing exposure to security risks and strengthening enterprise-wide cybersecurity resilience. By embedding vulnerability identification and recording into enterprise cybersecurity governance strategies, organizations enhance security risk accountability, improve regulatory compliance, and ensure sustainable vulnerability risk management strategies across evolving cybersecurity landscapes. That wraps up today's discussion on framework. Don't stop here. Head over to cyberauthor.me to explore more cybersecurity topics and discover a best-selling book covering NIST and other critical cyber frameworks. Please like, rate, and review this episode on Apple and Spotify. Until next time, remember that knowledge is power.